Saul, in one of his letters later, will refer to himself in the past of having been a Pharisee of Pharisees. We already postulated the idea that he probably didn't come to this identity on his own, but was raised likely by observant Pharisees. This meant that he would have been raised strictly being careful to observe the Levitical law found in the first 5 books of our Bible, what they would have called the Torah or the Pentateuch. So he would have been raised from a very early age within the synagogue system of Tarsus to begin to explore the Hebrew Scriptures and remember the stories of how God had dealt with the people of Israel and the covenant that he had made with the people of Israel and what that meant for God's action within the world. And as he got older, he would have started to read some of the interpretations of the famous rabbis and teachers and priests who would have written down interpretations of what these passages mean for the everyday life of every Jewish man and woman. Saul was clearly a gifted young man because we see him later as an authoritative figure within the temple structure in Jerusalem. And so somewhere in his upbringing and his education, a rabbi noticed that he had a knack for understanding God's word. And they would have referred him and sent him off to Jerusalem to continue his education so that he could become a leader amongst the Jewish people and a teacher of God's ways. Now, in Saul's day, the idea of religion was drastically different than today. Our idea of religion is that it's a privately held intellectual belief that has a kind of a wall between the outside world. In other words, we don't bring up religion in polite company or force our ideas on other people, and we kind of see it being a private thing. In fact, the whole motto of the United States often is separation of church and state. You've got the secular over here and the religious over there. But in Saul's day, the entire world was seen to be a spiritual one. And Saul himself would have seen no division between what he believed about how the world was and who God was and the world itself. He would have seen them inextricably tied. In fact, even the pagan world saw things this way. And so everything about the pagan world was set up around the temple worship of the pagan gods of their day. The marketplaces would have even been extensions of the pagan worship in the temples. They would have been selling meat that was sacrificed up in the temples, or they've been selling implements and things that could be used in the temple worship itself. The Roman world was especially observant of the pagan worship, and the Roman Caesar, it was a fairly new thing in Saul's day, but it was catching on like wildfire, would demand that all of the protectors, all the provinces under his control would worship and venerate him as a part of that pantheon. Of course, Jews couldn't participate in any of this. They would see this, any worship with the temple or veneration of the emperor, as an affront to their God and the covenant they've made with their God. And so they could not partake in any of those things. Now, this would have usually created some kind of a tension between them and the Roman Empire, and indeed there was kind of a rough edge of tension that was ready to explode at any point. But the Roman Empire desired above all else peace. And so they had set up this kind of agreement with the Jewish people, and they had given the Jewish people a bit of a kind of leeway to practice things in their system and their culture the way that they saw fit, as long as the Jewish people would remain peaceable and productive members of the Roman Empire, and that they would, in lieu of worshiping the emperor, at least pray to their God for Caesar's success. And so if they maintained and did these things, they could continue to be their own little subgroup within the Roman Empire. But because of the needs that the Jewish people had, the being willing to participate in the worship of temples kind of ostracized them from the communities around them and set them at a disadvantage, since they couldn't do business in the marketplace in the same way that other pagans could. And so they kind of cloistered together into communities, and they began to provide for each other, knowing that they had special needs of kosher foods or of observing the Sabbath on the Sabbath day. And so they would cloister together so that they could take care of those needs. Now, the Pharisees would have been especially sensitive to that tension between the Roman Empire and the Jewish people. You see that pop out throughout the entire history of the Roman Empire as the Jewish people existed among them, that there was wars and revolutions and civil wars that would occur occasionally from time to time when there is some reason for the Jewish people to kind of rise up and see this as an opportunity for them to bring about the purity of God's people by driving the Roman oppressors out. And the Pharisees would have always been on edge with this, and they would have always had this expectation that God might have called them at any given time to participate in a violent revolution against the state of Rome, to follow after God's covenant and God's orders and to be pure people of God. And we'll look a little bit about what created this expectation in the history of the Pharisees in the next video. But know this, in Saul's day, to be a Jewish Pharisee was a call towards purity and devotion to only the one true God, and they'd be ready at any given moment to forsake their own safety and forsake their own comfort to follow after God and His purity that He demanded for His people.